There's a strange problem that starts when your investment account reaches 6 figures. When you had $1,000, adding another $1,000 would have doubled your money. But when you have $100,000, that exact same $1,000 barely seems to change the picture. You're doing more, you've accumulated more, and somehow the finish line can feel farther away than it did before. That creates a very predictable reaction. You start looking for a bigger lever. Maybe you need to save another $500 a month, cut your lifestyle harder, find an investment with a higher return, or take more risk. Because if the goal is $1 million, looking at $100,000 and realizing you still need another $900,000 makes this feel like a savings problem you haven't solved yet. My name is Mike, and I think that interpretation misses the most important change happening inside your portfolio. At $100,000, savings still matters enormously, but you're approaching a stage where the dollars you already own can begin competing with the dollars you're able to add from your paycheck. And as the balance grows, those two forces do not remain equally important. So instead of asking how aggressively you need to save the next $900,000, I want to ask a different question. If you already have $100,000 invested, how much of the journey to $1 million actually needs to come out of your pocket? Start with the cleanest possible version of this problem. You have $100,000 invested today, and from this point forward, we'll assume a hypothetical 7% annual return. That is not a promise, and real markets will never hand you a smooth 7% every year. We're using one consistent assumption because I want you to see what changes as the portfolio gets larger. First, suppose you never contribute another dollar. At 7%, $100,000 becomes roughly $1,097,000 after 10 years, about $387,000 after 20 years, and around $761,000 after 30 years. Somewhere around year 34, it crosses $1 million. You only supplied the original $100,000, while roughly $900, 0 of the eventual balance came from hypothetical compounded growth, but the price you paid was time. Now let's introduce contributions. Keep the same $100,000 invested, but add $500 every month, or $6,000 a year. Under the same 7% assumption, after 10 years you'd have roughly $283,000. After 20 years, about $646,000. And you'd reach $1 million somewhere around year 27. Compared with contributing nothing, that monthly $500 potentially buys you about 7 years. Now double the contribution to $1,000 a month. You're putting in $2,000 a year, and under the same assumptions, you'd have roughly $370,000 after 10 years and about $906,000 after 20. You'd cross $1 million around year 22. So contributions clearly still matter. Going from $0 to $500 a month saves roughly 7 years, and going from $500 to $1,000 saves roughly another 5. But I want you to notice something more important than the finish date. Look at where the money is coming from along the way. With $100,000 invested, a hypothetical 7% year represents $7,000 of growth. If you're contributing $1,000 a month, you're adding $2,000 a year yourself. So at this stage, your paycheck is still doing more work than the portfolio. Now let the balance grow to $2,100,000. 7% of that is $1,400,000, which is already more than your $2,000 annual contribution. At $400,000, the same percentage represents $8,000. At $700,000, it represents $49,000, and at $900,000, it represents $63,000. Your contribution can remain exactly the same, while the dollar impact of the same percentage return becomes dramatically larger. Again, markets will not produce those numbers on schedule. A $400,000 portfolio could rise far more than $8,000 in 1 year and lose money the next. So these are illustrations of scale rather than forecasts. What matters is the relationship. Unless you increase your savings, your $2,000 annual contribution stays $2,000, while the amount of capital exposed to future gains and losses can keep expanding. That is the financial handoff most people miss. Early in wealth building, your contribution rate is overwhelmingly powerful because there simply isn't much capital working for you yet. If you have $1,000 invested, the difference between earning 6% and 7% for 1 year is only about $1,000. Finding another $300 a month to invest would add $3,600 over the year. So improving cash flow can matter far more than obsessing over investment performance. Now move the same person forward until the portfolio reaches $500,000. A 1 percentage point difference on that balance represents $5,000 in a year, and a 20% market decline would temporarily reduce the account by $100,000. At that scale, what happens to the capital you already accumulated can easily become larger than anything you can reasonably create by trimming another category from your monthly budget. This does not mean you reach $100,000 and stop contributing. In fact, continuing to contribute can dramatically shorten the journey, especially while the portfolio is still relatively small. The point is that you now have 2 engines instead of 1. Your labor keeps purchasing new assets, while the assets you already own have a growing ability to produce gains of their own. And those engines change in relative importance over time. Your salary might rise, and you might increase your contributions, but there is a practical limit to how much of your paycheck you can invest because you still need to live. Capital doesn't have that same ceiling. If the portfolio compounds successfully over decades, the base on which future returns are calculated can become several times larger without requiring you to work several times more hours. This gives us a better way to think about aggressive saving. Suppose you already have $100,000 and you're investing $1,000 a month, but you decide you could force that up to $2,000 by making your current lifestyle significantly tighter. Under our hypothetical 7% assumption, that could move the $1 million mark from roughly year 22 to around year 17. 5 years is meaningful, and depending on your goals, that trade could absolutely make sense. But notice what you're actually buying. You're giving up an additional $2,000 of current spending every year in exchange for an earlier arrival date. That is neither automatically good nor automatically bad. It is a trade between money today and time later. Once you see it that way, save as much as humanly possible stops being a complete financial strategy because the value of additional contributions has to be weighed against what those contributions cost your life today. There is another consequence of this handoff that becomes more important as the account grows. Interruptions get more expensive. Suppose you remove $20,000 from your portfolio and never replace it. If that $20,000 could hypothetically compound at 7% for another 25 years, it would grow to roughly $1,009,000. The long-term cost was not merely the $20,000 you spent. You also removed the future growth that money could have produced. This is why protecting the capital base starts becoming a bigger part of the game. During the first stage of wealth building, your main problem is creating enough investable money in the first place. During the next stage, you still need new money, but you also have something increasingly valuable to protect. A growing pool of capital with decades of potential compounding attached to it. So the path from $100,000 to $1 million is controlled by 3 broad variables. There is the capital you already have, the new money you continue adding, and the amount of uninterrupted time you give both of them. Contributions are highly controllable. Time is partially controllable through your behavior, and market returns are uncertain no matter how badly you want to turn them into a predictable number. That last distinction matters because the lever investors tend to obsess over is the one they control least. They search for an extra percentage point of return, while overlooking the enormous value of keeping a large capital base invested for another 5, 10, or 20 years. The bigger that base becomes, the more consequential that difference can become. So if you have $100,000 invested, your job is not simply to figure out how your paycheck can manufacture another $900,000. Your paycheck can keep feeding the machine, but increasingly the machine itself has the potential to do more of the work. The financial question gradually shifts from how much more you can force yourself to save toward how long you can keep a growing amount of capital working without unnecessarily disrupting it. The math is actually the easy part. You can understand the entire mechanism in a few minutes. Build the base, keep adding to it, and give that expanding base time. The harder question is why someone who understands all of this would still feel an almost irresistible urge to interfere with it. The problem is that your brain does not experience compounding the way a spreadsheet does. A spreadsheet is perfectly comfortable waiting 20 years for the biggest numbers to appear near the end. You are not. You experience your financial life month by month, purchase by purchase, paycheck by paycheck, which means you naturally pay more attention to what feels important today than to what becomes mathematically important over decades. That creates the first psychological trap after $100,000. You keep using the habits that built the portfolio as the only measure of progress. For years, progress was easy to understand. You earned money, transferred some of it into your account, and watched the balance rise largely because of what you personally added. Saving another $500 felt productive because there was a direct connection between your sacrifice and the result. But as the portfolio grows, that relationship gets messier. Suppose you're contributing $1,000 a month to a $300,000 portfolio. You can spend an entire year carefully adding $2,000, while normal market movement can change the account by more than that in either direction. You can make 12 responsible decisions and then watch a bad month temporarily erase the visible result of all 12, even though your long-term process hasn't necessarily changed at all. That feels deeply unsatisfying because effort and reward are no longer moving together. We like financial actions where the feedback is immediate. Save $2 and your $2 earn richer. Pay down $1,000 of debt and the balance falls by $1,000. Investing at scale is different. You can behave correctly and get negative feedback for months, while someone taking enormous risks can behave recklessly and temporarily get positive feedback. This is where recency bias becomes dangerous. When your portfolio has a strong year, it becomes easy to mentally promote that recent performance into your new expectation. When it has a weak year, the opposite happens. Suddenly, the long-term assumptions look naive, and whatever performed well recently starts looking like the obvious place your money should have been. Your strategy hasn't necessarily changed, but your emotional estimate of what should happen next changes constantly. And the larger your portfolio gets, the louder that emotional signal becomes, because percentages turn into meaningful dollar amounts. A 10% decline on $20,000 is $2,000. A 10% decline on $500,000 is $50,000. It's the same percentage, but one might feel like an unpleasant month, while the other can feel like you just watched a year of salary disappear from a screen. That is when loss aversion can collide directly with the math we just discussed. The capital base is becoming more powerful precisely because it is becoming larger, but that same size makes temporary losses harder to tolerate. The asset that now has more potential to compound also has enough scale to create frightening swings, so the moment when leaving the capital alone becomes increasingly valuable can also be the moment when leaving it alone becomes psychologically harder. There's another trap working in the opposite direction. Once someone has accumulated $100,000 or $2,000, they may start feeling that ordinary investing is too slow for the size of their ambition. $1 million still looks far away, and now they have enough capital that a more aggressive move seems capable of making a meaningful difference. That can turn impatience into overconfidence. The internal argument sounds reasonable. If 7% takes too long, maybe I need 10%. If 10% takes too long, maybe I need one concentrated investment that can do 20%. The goal quietly changes from building wealth to compressing time. And that distinction matters because expected return and risk usually do not separate just because your desired timeline is inconvenient. Go back to the two engines from the math section. Your contribution engine is relatively boring and controllable. Your capital engine is powerful but uncertain. The psychological mistake is trying to force the second engine to behave like the first one, as if you can simply decide how much return you want, in the same way you decide how much of your paycheck to contribute. You can choose to invest $1,000 next month. You cannot choose for your portfolio to earn $1,000 next month. That difference sounds obvious when I say it out loud, but a huge amount of financial behavior comes from refusing to emotionally accept it. We want a controllable outcome, so we start treating investment selection, market timing, and constant optimization as if more activity gives us more control. Then social comparison makes the problem worse. Your diversified portfolio might be behaving exactly as it was designed to behave, but somebody else will always own something that performed better over whatever period you happen to be looking at. When your account grows slowly while another asset doubles, your brain doesn't compare your actual strategy with your actual goals. It compares your real result with somebody else's best visible result. That comparison can completely distort the meaning of doing well. A portfolio that is progressing toward your goal can suddenly feel inadequate because it did not capture an opportunity you never planned around. Once that feeling takes over, the question stops being, is my current process capable of getting me where I need to go? And becomes, why didn't I make as much as that person? The danger is that this tends to happen exactly when the numbers become large enough to tempt you. Chasing an extra return on a $5,000 portfolio might not materially change your life either way. Making a concentrated mistake with $300,000 can. As your capital grows, the upside of cleverness looks more exciting, but the cost of unnecessary mistakes grows right alongside it. There's also a subtler problem with aggressive saving itself. Remember our example where increasing contributions from $1,000 to $2,000 a month could potentially move the million-dollar date forward by several years. When you see that calculation, it is tempting to conclude that every available dollar should be invested because arriving earlier must always be better. That is where mental accounting can hide the actual trade. You may treat money invested for the future as responsible money and money spent today as wasted money, even when the spending supports something you genuinely value. Once those labels take over, maximizing the portfolio can become a scoreboard rather than a tool, and you can end up optimizing a number without asking what the number is supposed to accomplish. The opposite mistake is lifestyle inflation. As income rises, the additional cash flow that could strengthen your contribution engine gets absorbed into a more expensive default life. Nothing feels extravagant because each upgrade arrives separately. A slightly better apartment, a slightly better car, more convenient travel, more subscriptions, more expensive routines. Eventually your income is much higher, but the amount available to invest barely changed. So you're being pulled from both directions. One person sacrifices too much because every additional contribution feels morally superior to spending. Another allows every raise to disappear because current consumption always feels more tangible than future compounding. Neither is really solving the optimization problem. They're reacting to whichever side of the trade feels emotionally louder. The healthier way to see it is that contributions and compounding have different jobs. Contributions help you build and accelerate the capital base, especially early. Time gives that capital the opportunity to become disproportionately important later. You don't need to maximize one while ignoring the other. You need a contribution level you can sustain long enough for the second engine to actually get its chance. And that word, sustain, is where the psychology finally connects back to the million-dollar goal. A mathematically aggressive plan that makes you miserable for 3 years and then collapses can be worse than a less aggressive plan you can maintain for 20. The spreadsheet only sees the contribution amount. It doesn't see whether the person making those contributions eventually gets exhausted, changes strategy, raids the account, chases performance, or abandons the plan. That is why reaching $1 million from $100,000 is not simply a test of how much financial pain you can tolerate today. The portfolio is gradually becoming capable of carrying more of the load, but only if your behavior allows it to remain in the game. The challenge is learning when to push the contribution engine, when to trust the capital engine, and when your desire to do something is actually the biggest threat to both. So we need a framework that answers a more practical question. Once you have meaningful capital working for you, what should you actively control? What should you deliberately leave alone? And how do you know whether an additional sacrifice today is actually buying enough time to be worth it? So here's the framework I would use once the portfolio reaches a size where both your contributions and your capital matter. Don't start with the question, how can I get to $1 million faster? Start by separating the variables you control from the ones you don't. You control how much you contribute, how consistently you invest, how much risk you choose to take, and whether you interrupt the process. You do not control what the market returns next year. That distinction immediately removes a lot of useless activity. If your plan only works when the market gives you 12% instead of 7%, you haven't necessarily created a better plan. You may have created a plan that requires an outcome you cannot command. A stronger plan is built around reasonable assumptions and treats unusually strong returns as upside, rather than something your future depends on. Next, give your contribution rate a job instead of simply trying to maximize it. Pick an amount that moves the timeline meaningfully without making the rest of your financial life unnecessarily fragile. If you're investing $1, zero in a month and increasing that to $1.200 barely changes the result you care about, there may be no reason to obsess over extracting that final $2. If increasing it substantially moves financial independence several years closer and the sacrifice is acceptable to you, that is a different decision. You can test this with a very simple exercise. Run your plan at your current contribution, then run it again with the higher contribution you're considering. Don't just look at the final balance. Look at how many years the additional money actually buys you. Now you can compare something concrete. The lifestyle cost today versus the time potentially gained later. That is a much better question than whether spending money is good or bad. Maybe investing another $500 a month moves your target forward enough that you happily make the trade. Maybe it barely changes the date, and you would rather use some of that money for something important now. Personal finance becomes much clearer when you stop turning every dollar into a moral judgment and start asking what each dollar is actually purchasing. Then create a rule for raises before they arrive. Lifestyle inflation is difficult to notice because there is rarely one dramatic decision that destroys your savings rate. Your spending simply expands until the new income feels normal. So decide in advance that some portion of future raises, bonuses, or other increases in income will automatically increase your investments while the rest can improve your life today. The exact percentage is less important than making the decision before the money changes what feels normal. If your income increases by $1,000 and you immediately absorb all $1,000 into your lifestyle, going backward later will feel like a pay cut. If part of that increase never enters your spending baseline, you can strengthen the contribution engine without repeatedly fighting yourself. Now we get to the capital engine, and the rule here is different. The bigger the portfolio becomes, the higher the standard should be before you make a major change to it. Not because changing an investment is always wrong, but because the dollar consequences of unnecessary decisions increase with the size of the account. Before making a major move, ask what actually changed. Did your time horizon change? Did your need for the money change? Did your risk capacity change? Did the investment itself stop serving the role you originally bought it for? Those are reasons worth examining. This other thing went up a lot recently is not the same category of information. This is especially important during large market declines. If you own a portfolio whose risk you understood and deliberately chose, a falling price does not automatically mean your original plan stopped making sense. Sometimes circumstances genuinely do change and a portfolio should change with them. But fear itself is not new financial information. The point of choosing an appropriate level of risk before the decline is to reduce the chance that you redesign the plan in the middle of one. And I would put one more barrier around withdrawals from long-term investments. Before removing money, calculate not only what you are taking out today, but what that capital might have become over your remaining time horizon under a reasonable hypothetical return. That doesn't mean you should never use invested money. Money exists to support your life, but you should see the full trade before making the decision. Remember our $20,000 example. At a hypothetical 7% for 25 years, that money could become roughly $1,009,000. If you still decide that using the $20,000 today is worth giving up that potential future value, fine. At least you made the decision with the opportunity cost visible instead of treating the withdrawal as though its only cost were the number leaving the account today. Finally, stop using $1 million as if the number itself contains a financial plan. $1 million can be a useful milestone, but what matters is what you expect the money to do for you. Your future spending, taxes, inflation, other income, time horizon, and withdrawal needs all affect what that balance actually means. The target should serve the life you're trying to fund, not the other way around. And that brings us back to why $100,000 matters. There is nothing magical about crossing six figures. Your money does not receive a different return because your account added another digit. What changes is the relationship between the money you can add and the money already working. And that relationship keeps shifting as the portfolio grows. At $1,000,000, your ability to save can overwhelm almost everything else. At $100,000, capital starts becoming noticeable. At several $100,000, normal market movement can exceed what you contribute in an entire year. Eventually, if the portfolio grows enough, your invested capital can move by more in a year than you could realistically save from your paycheck. That is the handoff I want you to recognize. Building wealth begins as a savings problem because you need to create the capital. Over time, it increasingly becomes a capital management and time problem because the asset base you created needs enough uninterrupted years to do meaningful work. So if you already have $100,000 invested, don't look at the remaining $900,000 and assume you personally have to earn, save, and deposit every dollar of that distance. Keep feeding the portfolio at a sustainable rate, protect the capital you work to build, and be extremely skeptical whenever impatience tells you that a more exciting strategy must be a faster one. You built the first engine with your paycheck. Now you're building the second engine with capital and time. The goal isn't to stop working because compounding will magically do everything for you. And it isn't to sacrifice every part of your present life just to force the finish line closer. It's to understand which engine matters at each stage and avoid sabotaging one while trying to optimize the other. That's the shift from $100,000 to $1 million. Contributions start the process, capital makes it scalable, and time gives that capital the opportunity to matter. My name is Mike. If you want more videos that break wealth building down into the numbers and decisions that actually matter, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.